They all thought it was a harmless joke, a moment of quick laughter to brighten their morning, a silly prank that would be forgotten by lunchtime. But I remember the sting of it as clearly as the taste that filled my mouth. He sat across the table from me, my oldest grandson, lanky and restless in the way boys are when they are almost men, but not yet quite there. And he watched me lift my mug with both hands, watched me take that first sip like I did every morning, watched me close my eyes and inhale the smell before swallowing. And then he laughed when I gagged. Not a small, embarrassed laugh, but a burst of amusement that seemed to shake the whole room. My coffee, my one quiet ritual, the one part of the day that belonged to me, was filled with salt. I felt it hit the back of my throat like sand and brine, coating my tongue, my stomach rolling instantly. And when I set the mug down, confused, I saw the way he was looking at me, like I was the punchline he had been waiting for. Before I could ask, before I could even wipe my mouth, my daughter's voice came from the kitchen doorway, sharp with that mix of indulgence and irritation that she saves for him. "What did you do now?" And he didn't hide it, didn't even try. He grinned, lifting the little plastic salt shaker and shaking it in the air like a trophy, and said, "I switched the sugar. I wanted to see if she'd notice." Then, as if to make it worse, he turned to his phone on the table, pressing the screen to replay whatever he had filmed while I sat there, unaware. They had caught the whole thing. My quiet sipping, my face changing, my confusion, and now it was in his hands, his voice in the background laughing. My daughter rolled her eyes and told him to cut it out, but there was no weight in her tone, nothing that told him this was wrong. She didn't delete the video. She didn't ask if I was all right. She just told him to get ready for school and turned away. I sat there in the dining room, staring at the half-drunk cup, the grains of white still floating in the surface, wondering why the taste in my mouth felt like more than salt. It felt like something had been named out loud, something that had been there all along, but now stood in the center of the room where everyone could see it. That I was here, in this house, not as someone to be respected, but as someone to be managed, tolerated, maybe even mocked when the mood struck. They had said it was temporary, this living arrangement, just until I got back on my feet, just until I figured things out after my lease ended, just until the holidays were over, then just until spring, then just until they sorted a few things. 11 months later, I was still here. My belongings in a couple of boxes in the garage, my bed a narrow cot wedged between the laundry machines and the water heater. I told myself I didn't mind, that it was warm and dry and that I wasn't in the way, but mornings like this one made me feel the truth. I was in the way just by existing, even when I was perfectly still. They'd started calling me Grandma in that tone. Capital G, but lowercase in spirit. Not the affectionate name my friends' grandchildren used, but something functional, like a label on a storage bin. My grandson would yell it from across the house when he needed a sandwich or couldn't find his socks. My daughter used it when she wanted me to keep an eye on the younger one so she could have a quiet moment on her phone. And every time they said it, it felt less like a name and more like a reminder of the role they had assigned me. Helper, babysitter, background presence. Never the person I was before I moved in here. I used to have mornings of my own. I used to wake in a room that smelled like my sheets and the faint lavender I sprinkled in my dresser drawers. I would open the curtains and let the light fall across my own table, my own mug, my own small kitchen that no one barged into. The coffee was mine, The silence was mine, even the sound of the kettle clicking off belonged to me. Here, in this house, even the air in the mornings felt borrowed. I waited for the sound of the shower to stop before I dared step into the hall, waited for the clatter of breakfast to settle before I approached the kitchen, always careful not to be in the middle of things. When I first moved in, I thought that was politeness. Now I think it was training, self-imposed, learned quickly, so that no one would have to tell me directly to stay out of the way. The salt in the coffee wasn't about the coffee. I think I knew that the moment I set the mug down and saw his smile. It was about being reminded, in a way that made everyone laugh, that my place here was provisional, that I was easy to disrupt and easier to ignore. Maybe he didn't mean it that way. Maybe in his mind it was a prank, just a thing boys do. But when you've been on the receiving end of too many just jokes, you stop hearing the laughter as harmless. You hear it as proof that you are the one they can play with, the one they can film, the one they can forget about when it's time to clean up. And when no one steps in, not really, not in a way that matters, it becomes more than a joke. It becomes a story they'll tell later about the time Grandma didn't notice the salt until it was too late. And I'll be in that story, trapped, voiceless, a prop in the memory. I rinsed the mug and poured the rest of the coffee down the sink, watching the cloudy water swirl into the drain. I didn't say anything to him, didn't tell him off, didn't demand an apology. Part of me wanted to, but another part, the part that had been keeping me quiet for months, knew it wouldn't change anything. He would shrug, maybe mutter sorry without looking up from his phone, and later he'd laugh about how mad I got. So I swallowed the words along with the last taste of salt on my tongue and went back to my corner of the house. I closed the thin curtain that hung across the laundry alcove like a pretend wall and sat on the cot, my hands resting in my lap. The machines hummed beside me, the dryer door rattling slightly with each turn, a sound I'd grown used to as the backdrop of my nights. I stared at the little plastic crate where I kept my things, folded sweaters, a paperback novel, the jar of instant coffee I bought with my own money. I thought about how many mornings had started here, how many days I had ended without being asked once how I was, and how each one made it harder to remember that I used to be someone who had a life outside of these walls. It would have been easy to cry. I think that's what they might have expected if they'd thought about it at all, that I would retreat to my corner and have a small, private moment of hurt, then come out again smiling as if nothing had happened. But there were no tears, just a kind of clarity, a thin, sharp edge running through my thoughts, telling me that something had shifted. I couldn't have said then what it meant or where it would lead, only that the taste of salt in my mouth was not going to fade as quickly as they assumed. Some things stay with you, not because of their size, but because they land exactly on the spot that was already sore. And when that happens, when the laughter dies down and everyone moves on except you start to wonder, not if you can endure it, but why you should. The morning after the salt incident, I tried to hold on to some semblance of normalcy, though I knew deep down that the balance in this house had already begun to tilt, shifting like the uneven floorboards beneath my feet, betraying cracks I hadn't dared to see before. I made my coffee with my usual care, measured the powder with the spoon I had kept since my husband died, watching the little whirlpool of granules dissolve in the water, filling the kitchen with the faint, comforting smell that had always meant something safe. I sat down at the small table squeezed between the refrigerator and the laundry basket, my hands wrapped around the warm mug, feeling its heat seep into my fingers. And for a moment, I let myself pretend that this was still my home, that I belonged. Here, that the walls held memories that included me. But the silence was different that day. Heavier, brittle, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. I heard the front door open and close, the patter of footsteps, too loud, too hurried, coming down the hall, and I looked up just in time to see my grandson come around the corner, earbuds dangling from his neck, a sly grin playing on his lips. He held the phone in one hand, the screen lit up, and he didn't bother to hide what he was about to do. I knew before he said a word, before the glint in his eyes became clear. He was about to humiliate me again, and this time he was going to make sure everyone could see it. He took a sip of the coffee I had just poured, deliberately pretending to enjoy the taste. Then suddenly, with a quick movement, he lifted his phone and pressed record, pointing it at me. "Hey, Grandma, remember yesterday? Salt in the coffee? Well, watch this." He laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the empty walls, and before I could protest or even look away, he poured a whole packet of salt into my fresh mug, making it glisten unnaturally in the morning light. The room filled with his laughter, the sound spreading to the kitchen where my daughter stood, arms crossed, watching without stepping in. The other grandchildren, scattered through the house, began to peek around corners or linger near the doorway, phones out, anticipating the moment they could share the next funny clip. It was a performance, a spectacle of me, the old woman, reduced to a joke for their entertainment. And the worst part wasn't the act itself, but the fact that no one stopped it, no one said, "Enough." Instead, my daughter smiled faintly and said, "Oh, come on, it's just a joke. Don't be so serious." Her voice was soft but firm, like a judge passing sentence without the chance of appeal. I took a breath and looked at the faces around me, feeling the weight of their amusement press down on my chest. I saw the casual cruelty in my grandson's eyes, the distracted tolerance in my daughter's, the eager curiosity of the younger children who had learned that laughing at Grandma was a game everyone played. My mouth went dry. My hands trembled slightly, but I held onto my seat, refusing to break in front of them. I knew that if I reacted with anger or tears, it would only feed their delight, give them the power to call me overly sensitive or too old to keep up. So I sat still, swallowing the lump in my throat, the taste of salt mixing with the bitterness, rising inside me. That moment, the pouring of salt into my fresh coffee, was more than just a prank. It was a message, a clear and calculated reminder that I was no longer a cherished family member, no longer a person whose dignity mattered. I was a fixture, a punchline, someone who could be humiliated for sport without consequence. I thought about the years behind me, the birthdays celebrated, the dinners cooked, the nights spent soothing frightened children, the bills paid quietly from my small pension, and how all that labor had evaporated into this single act of disregard. The salt was the bitterness of neglect, crystallized and poured out where it could be tasted most plainly. The day stretched on with the usual rhythms of the house, but for me, everything felt off. Meals were eaten without conversation, my presence ignored except when my hands were needed to serve or clean. The house, once warm with laughter and chatter, felt colder, more fractured. I overheard snippets of conversations in hushed tones, phrases like, "Grandma's getting old," "She doesn't understand," "Maybe it's time to find another solution." I wasn't sure what that solution meant, but the fear settled in my stomach like a stone. I tried to keep to myself, avoiding the spaces where their eyes lingered on me like a problem waiting to be solved. That evening, when everyone had gone to bed, I sat alone in the dim light of the kitchen, my hands wrapped around a cup of tea instead of coffee, the steam rising in gentle spirals as I thought about what had happened. The house was quiet now, but the echoes of the day rang loud in my mind. I realized that the salt in my coffee was only the beginning, that the real erosion was happening in the spaces between words, in the silences, in the way I was being slowly pushed out of their lives without a word of protest. I felt the sharp edge of betrayal, not just from my grandson's careless cruelty, but from the absence of protection, from the way my daughter let it happen as if it were normal, inevitable. In the days that followed, the pranks didn't stop. Sometimes it was small things, a misplaced item, a turned-down invitation, a whispered joke behind my back, but they all carried the same weight. Each act chipped away at the fragile sense of belonging I clung to. I caught myself shrinking, becoming smaller in my own skin, learning the careful dance of invisibility. Yet, somewhere beneath the ache, a spark began to flicker. A quiet reckoning that whispered, I didn't have to endure this. That dignity was not something handed down with age, but something I could reclaim, even if it meant stepping away from the family that had forgotten how to see me. That spark grew on a day when, while helping my grandson with his laundry, I found his earbuds lying tangled in the pocket of his jeans. They were new, expensive, a prized possession he guarded jealously. I held them in my hands and thought about the salt in my coffee, about the laughter that had followed, about the quiet moments when I felt like I was disappearing. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of something fierce, a desire to push back, to remind them all that I was not a joke, not a punchline, not a shadow on the edge of their lives. And so I did what I never imagined I would. That night, when the house was asleep and the world outside hushed, I took a small tube of superglue from the bathroom cabinet and carefully dabbed a tiny drop inside each earbud, sealing them shut. It was a small act, quiet and irreversible, a line drawn without words but with all the clarity of a shouted declaration. I placed the earbuds back where I had found them and went to bed, knowing that when morning came, nothing would be the same. The salt in my coffee was the opening salvo, but the glued earbuds were my answer, my way of reclaiming a small piece of respect that had been stolen. When the house woke to the cries and confusion that followed, when the chaos swirled and accusations flew, I remained silent. I said nothing about what I had done, but in that silence, I found a strange peace. The salt had been a wound, but the glue was a boundary, a refusal to be erased any longer. And though the path ahead was uncertain and the cost still unknown, I knew that this moment was the turning point where I stopped being invisible and started being seen again, even if only in the sharpest, most stubborn way possible. After the episode with the superglued earbuds, the house seemed to shift in subtle, almost imperceptible ways, like the slow turning of the seasons or the quiet erosion of a shoreline. Changes so gradual that they escape notice until one day you realize the landscape you once knew has vanished. The morning light came through the kitchen window with its usual softness, but I no longer felt the comfort I used to find in those familiar rays. Instead, I felt the weight of eyes that watched me not with warmth or concern, but with a kind of careful calculation, as if waiting to see how I would react, waiting to see whether I would retreat or resist. The glued earbuds had sent a message, but it also marked me in a new way. I was no longer just the quiet grandmother in the corner. I was the troublemaker, the one who pushed back. And that came with its own consequences. My daughter's patience, which had always felt like a thin thread stretched tight, began to fray visibly. At first, it was small things. A sigh when I asked for a cup of tea, a glance that lingered too long and held more blame than love. She started to micromanage my days more openly, reminding me of my limitations, suggesting I avoid certain rooms during family gatherings, insisting that I not engage with the grandchildren beyond supervised visits. The eldest boy, who had poured salt in my coffee and had his earbuds sabotaged in turn, grew colder, less inclined to even acknowledge my presence. The house became a place where I was there, but not there. A ghost tethered by obligation, but excluded from the warmth. Meals were the hardest. Once, the kitchen table had been a place of stories and laughter, where generations gathered, and the air smelled of cinnamon and roasting meat. Now, I was given a small tray to eat in the laundry alcove, my food portioned and labeled as if I were a patient rather than a family member. When I tried to join the others, I was met with averted eyes or polite silence, the kind that speaks volumes. I remembered the countless dinners I had prepared for birthdays, holidays, late-night recoveries from school, and I felt a hollow ache that went beyond hunger. The children's laughter carried on without me, the kind that no longer invited me in, but pushed me out. The house itself seemed to close around me. My belongings, already few, were shuffled from place to place, sometimes disappearing altogether, only to reappear weeks later in forgotten corners. One day, my favorite cardigan, the one I wore on cold mornings because it smelled faintly of my late husband, was missing. When I asked, my daughter replied without looking up, "I thought you'd want to wash it. It smelled a little stale." It was a lie. She never intended to return it. I found it months later, faded and stretched, stuffed in the back of a closet where I was sure she hoped I wouldn't look. Financial control tightened as well. The small allowance I was given to buy groceries was slashed under the pretext that I didn't eat much and shouldn't spend money unnecessarily. When I questioned it, I was told, "You're not a child, but you're not managing well either." The bank. Statements that I once managed independently were now handled by my daughter, who reassured me with a smile that she was helping. But the message was clear. I was no longer trusted with my own affairs. My pension, which had been my safety net, was slowly becoming a point of contention, as if my money was an inconvenient truth to be hidden or controlled. The emotional toll was the hardest to bear. I found myself withdrawing, retreating deeper into silence, the quiet corners of the house becoming my refuge and my prison. The phone calls from friends dwindled, as though word had spread that I was no longer up. Invitations to community events, book clubs, church gatherings, once the lifeblood of my social world, stopped coming. When I tried to ask why, the answer was always a gentle excuse. They understand. It's just hard to keep up. But what they really meant was that I was no longer part of the conversation, no longer a person whose company mattered. I was becoming invisible. Sometimes, late at night, I would lie awake and replay moments in my mind. The way my grandson had laughed at my coffee. The way my daughter's eyes had hardened after the earbuds incident. The way the family moved through the house without me. Like I was furniture, not flesh and blood. I thought about my own mother, who had fought hard to keep her dignity, even when the world tried to strip it away. I wondered if she had ever felt this way, this slow erasure, this fading into silence. The memories were both balm and burden. They reminded me who I was and who I was becoming if I didn't find a way to stop the slide. But the turning point was quieter than I expected. It wasn't a grand confrontation or a dramatic outburst. It was a simple, everyday moment that crystallized the truth I had been avoiding. I was standing by the kitchen sink, rinsing a dish after dinner, when I overheard my daughter on the phone in the next room. She was speaking in a hushed, clipped tone, the kind people use when they don't want to be overheard, but can't quite hide the disdain. "She's getting harder to manage," I heard her say. "It's like she's losing it, but she's still stubborn. I'm thinking we need to look at some options, maybe a care facility. It's better for everyone." The word manage caught in my throat. I set the dish down with a clatter and stayed silent, my hands trembling, my heart pounding. I wasn't losing myself. I was being pushed away. That night, I sat in the dark, the house around me quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock. I thought about the life I had left behind, the choices I had made, the years I had poured into this family, and the years that were now folding over me like a shroud. The first step was the hardest to imagine: leaving. But that thought brought a strange relief, a glimmer of hope. If I stayed, I would become less and less until there was nothing left to recognize. If I left, I could begin to find myself again, even if it meant starting from nothing. I began to make plans in secret, small steps that no one would notice, but that felt like revolutions inside my chest. I called an old friend from my neighborhood who still lived alone, a woman who had once taught me to knit and who had always believed in second chances. I asked if she knew of any rooms for rent, places where an old woman could live quietly and with dignity. She gave me a number and promised to help. I started gathering my few possessions, choosing what to take and what to leave behind. Each item a thread connecting me to a past that was slipping away, but that I was not yet ready to sever. At the same time, I reclaimed small acts of autonomy within the house that had grown so constrictive. I insisted on making my own coffee, even if it meant the mug sat unused by the others. I walked to the park alone in the afternoons, feeling the sun on my face, reminding myself that the world outside still existed, still held promise. I began to write in a notebook, scribbling memories, thoughts, plans, as if the ink could map a way out of the shadows. It was a slow, steady reclaiming of self, one that happened beneath the surface of their awareness. And through it all, the salt in the coffee and the glued earbuds echoed in my mind, markers of a boundary crossed and a boundary drawn. They were symbols of the erasure and the resistance, the pain and the fight. I was no longer willing to be invisible. The path forward was uncertain, the risks real, but the promise of reclaiming my life, my voice, my dignity was too powerful to ignore. I knew that change would not come all at once, but with each small step, with each quiet act of defiance and self-care, I was building the foundation for a new chapter, one where I was no longer just grandma, but myself again. The day I finally stepped out the front door without looking back, I felt the weight of years pressing down on me like the heavy coat I wore, the one I had bought with my own money after years of putting others first. It was a simple navy blue, nothing fancy, but it felt like armor, solid, familiar, a reminder that I still had a right to choose for myself. The air was crisp, tinged with the first breath of autumn, and as I locked the door behind me, I realized I hadn't done this in a long time. Left without a plan to return, my heart thrummed with a mixture of fear and a strange, burgeoning hope that had been absent for too long. I wasn't running away, I told myself. I was walking toward something new, something I had forgotten I deserved. The taxi ride to the small boarding house where my friend had found me, a room, was quiet. The city blurring past the window in shades of gray and gold. The driver was an older man who recognized the look in my eyes, the mix of determination and weariness, and he didn't ask questions, just offered a small smile when I thanked him. I clutched my bag close, feeling the reassuring weight of my few possessions inside. The sweater my husband had knitted, a well-worn book of poetry, my journal, and the small jar of instant coffee that still reminded me of mornings before this life. When the cab pulled up to the faded brick building with its chipped paint and creaking sign, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in months. Possibility. Inside, the room was small but clean, with a narrow bed tucked into the corner, a small desk by the window, and a worn armchair that seemed to have been waiting for me. It smelled faintly of lavender and old books, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the space belonged to me. My friend, Joyce, met me at the door with a cigarette in one hand, and a kind of gruff warmth that was both comforting and unfamiliar. She didn't ask why I'd come or what I was running from. She just nodded and said, "You're here now. That's what matters." Settling into this new life was harder than I expected. The routines I had known were gone, replaced by the rhythms of quiet independence and tentative trust. I found a small job at a local cafe, a place where the smell of coffee and toast filled the air and where the regulars nodded to me with a kindness that felt strange, but welcome. Each morning, I put on my navy coat and walked the few blocks to work, feeling the cool air on my face, the city's pulse beneath my feet. The work was honest and simple, and it gave me something I hadn't realized I'd lost, a purpose beyond being grandma or the problem. The people I met were different from those I had left behind, but in their differences, I found connection. Heather, the manager of the cafe, was quiet but steady, and she gave me a chance without questions, just the expectation that I would show up and do my best. Arthur, a regular customer, came in every day at the same time, his eyes kind, and his stories about birds and the city's changing seasons weaving a gentle thread of companionship through my days. These relationships were fragile and new, but they felt real in a way that I hadn't felt in years. Living in Joyce's house was an adjustment, too. The walls were thin, and the noises of the neighborhood crept in. The barking dogs, the late-night conversations, the creaking floorboards. But it was alive in a way my old home had stopped being. Joyce herself was a presence of contradictions. A woman who could grumble and swear but also bake lemon squares and listen without judgment. We settled into a rhythm of shared meals, quiet evenings, and the slow building of trust that comes from simply being there for each other. But the real change was happening inside me. Each day, I peeled back the layers of silence and resignation I had wrapped around myself, finding parts of myself I thought had been lost forever. I read again, wrote in my journal, laughed softly at Arthur's jokes, and let the city's rhythms remind me that life still had a shape, a meaning beyond survival. The navy coat hung on a hook by the door became a symbol of this reclamation. Not just a piece of clothing, but proof that I was still here, still choosing, still capable of living on my own terms. One afternoon, as I walked through a park with the fading light casting long shadows, I thought about the family I had left behind. The grandson who had poured salt in my coffee, the daughter who had watched and said nothing, the house that had grown. Colder with each passing day, I didn't feel anger as much as a quiet sorrow, a recognition that the ties that had once bound us had frayed beyond repair. but I also felt a fierce gratitude for this moment of freedom, this chance to rewrite the last chapters of my story. Freedom, I realized, wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. It was about small choices. The decision to walk away, to speak up, to hold on to dignity when it felt like no one else would. It was about reclaiming space in a world that had tried to shrink me down until I was no bigger than a shadow. And as the wind whispered through the trees and the city breathed around me, I knew that this was only the beginning. After weeks of carefully stitching together a new life from fragments of independence and small joys, the past returned with the force of a storm, shattering the fragile calm I had come to cherish and forcing me to face the ghosts I thought I had left behind. 2. It began with a letter slipped beneath the door of my modest room in the boarding house where I now lived, a plain envelope with a familiar scrawl that made my heart both tighten and loosen, like the first breath after holding it too long underwater. The name on the front was my grandson's, Kieran, the boy who had once poured salt in my coffee and whom I had only begun to understand through distance and quiet reflection. The letter was short, tentative, and full of the awkward warmth of someone reaching across a gulf they don't fully comprehend. "Grandma," it began, "I miss you. Dad and Lisa are worried. Please come home." I held the paper in my hands, reading and rereading the few lines as if they contained a secret code, a map back to a place I wasn't sure I belonged anymore. The arrival of that letter opened a floodgate I hadn't expected. Calls followed, some from unknown numbers, others from voices I recognized but had long ceased to expect. My daughter's voice was strained and clipped, her words tinged with frustration and a vague apology that never quite reached the edges of sincerity. "We're worried, Mom," she said. "You're hurting people, including yourself." My son's voice came next, cold and demanding, a litany of accusations thinly veiled as concern. "You're making a scene," he said. "You're tearing the family apart." I listened in silence, the phone heavy in my hand, the words washing over me like waves against a rocky shore. Sometimes sharp and cutting, sometimes dull and relentless. I didn't respond. I wasn't ready to enter that storm again, but the letters and calls were only the beginning. Soon, a lawyer appeared, an official, unyielding presence who arrived at the boarding house under the guise of checking on my well-being, but whose questions felt like an interrogation. He spoke in careful, measured tones about next steps, legal guardianship, and the best interests of all parties involved, words that felt cold and clinical in the intimate space I had carved out for myself. I answered him calmly, firmly asserting my autonomy, my sound mind, and my right to live as I chose. Yet beneath the surface of those words lay a simmering tension, a battle being fought not in courtrooms, but in whispered conversations and veiled threats. The media soon caught wind of the story. A local newspaper ran an article about the missing grandmother, complete with a faded photo from a family gathering years ago. Me, smiling politely, holding a pie dish, the warmth in the picture a stark contrast to the cold narrative beneath. The piece quoted my son, who spoke of deep concern and stress on the family, and my daughter, who described me as vulnerable and at risk. The words were carefully chosen, designed to elicit sympathy while casting doubt on my ability to care. For myself, I read the article with a bitter laugh, the kind of laugh that startles even the one who makes it. They painted me as fragile, lost, a shadow of the woman I was. yet they could not see the fierce flame still burning beneath the surface, the quiet strength that had carried me this far. At the cafe, Heather, the manager who had become one of my few allies, brought me the clipping with a look of disbelief. "You okay?" she asked quietly, her eyes searching mine for a crack I wasn't willing to show. I nodded, folding the paper carefully and slipping it into my jacket pocket. "Never better," I said, though the words felt hollow. The truth was more complicated. The article was proof that the family's narrative was being shaped without me, that the story being told was one where I was the problem to be managed, the inconvenient truth to be contained. It was a reminder that the past was not finished with me yet, that the ties I had tried to sever still pulled with relentless force. The tension at home escalated as well. My daughter's visits became more frequent, less tentative, filled with sharp questions and thinly veiled accusations. One afternoon, she appeared at the cafe where I worked, standing awkwardly by the pastry display as if unsure whether to approach or flee. Her eyes searched mine, a flicker of something unreadable passing between us. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice low. I nodded, motioning to the empty booth at the back. There, amid the hum of morning rush and clatter of cups, we faced each other like strangers forced together by history. She spoke of panic, of fear for the children's well-being, of the strain my absence had placed on the family. "We thought you were behind us at the airport," she said quietly, referencing the day I had been left behind, abandoned in that sterile lounge, a suitcase among travelers who moved on without me. I raised an eyebrow, the memory sharp and unforgiving. 8 hours, Lisa, I said. 8 hours of waiting. Her eyes dropped to her hands, perfectly manicured, always pristine in a way I had never been. "We panicked," she whispered. "We didn't know what to do." I listened without interrupting, my silence a wall between us. When she reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope, I understood that the conversation had shifted from words to gestures. "I don't want anything from you," she said, "but Kieran, he's struggling. He misses you." I took the envelope, not because I desired what was inside, but because I refused to give her the satisfaction of refusal. The money was a symbol, a thread attempting to pull me back into a life I had chosen to leave behind. "He doesn't need a go-between," I said quietly. "He knows how to call." She nodded, her eyes meeting mine briefly, no longer sharp but weary. "He might," she said. In that moment, the years of tension, betrayal, and quiet erasure hung between us like a storm cloud. Yet beneath the thunder, there was something fragile, an admission that neither of us was entirely free, that the family we once were was tangled in expectations and disappointments too complex to unravel in a single conversation. I stood, leaving her with the weight of my words and the silence that followed. "I'm not your shadow, Lisa," I said as I walked away. "I'm my own person." The weeks that followed were a blur of legal letters, phone calls, and guarded meetings with social workers and lawyers. The house where I had once been a presence became a battleground for control and narrative. I refused to be the helpless woman they portrayed me to be. I hired a local attorney, a quiet but formidable woman who understood the nuances of my situation and stood firmly by my side. Letters went back and forth, each word carefully chosen, each sentence a declaration of my autonomy and refusal to be erased. Amid this turmoil, I found solace in unexpected places. Arthur, the regular at the cafe, brought small gifts, a hand-painted magnet shaped like a birdhouse, a simple gesture that spoke of quiet understanding and friendship without demands. Joyce, my landlady and companion, remained steady and unflinching, offering a refuge of normalcy and support. And slowly, amidst the chaos, I began to rebuild a sense of self that was no longer tethered to the judgments and expectations of a family that had never truly seen me. One evening, I wrote a letter, not to the family, but to Lisa. 3 simple lines, calm and clear. I know what you did. I know what you didn't say. I'm not angry. I'm not coming back. I mailed it the next morning with a stamp bearing a finch, the small bird that sings even in the cold. I did not expect a response. Instead, life moved forward in quiet determination. And then, unexpectedly, Lisa showed up in the cafe one gray afternoon, standing stiffly by the pastry display. Our eyes met briefly, and in that moment, I saw a woman worn thin by regret and fear. A woman who had tried to replace me, but found the shadow impossible to fill. She didn't stay long, leaving without finishing her coffee, leaving behind a silence heavier than any argument. That night, sitting on the porch with Joyce, wrapped in blankets against the chill, I felt the weight of the journey I had undertaken, the betrayals, the losses, the small victories, and knew that while the path ahead was uncertain, I had reclaimed something precious. I was no longer invisible. I was no longer a ghost in a family story. I was a woman who had chosen herself. The morning I sent that letter to the lawyer marked a turning point I had long awaited, but never fully dared to imagine. I sat at the small kitchen table in Joyce's modest home, the early light filtering through the curtains and casting a soft glow over the folded envelope in front of me. My hands trembled slightly as I sealed it, the weight of years of silence and compromise pressing down on me. This letter was different, not a plea, not an explanation, but a declaration. I was reclaiming my voice in a way that no one could ignore or dismiss. The words were simple and firm, written with the steady hand of someone who had finally seen the end of one journey and the beginning of another. To whom it may concern, there is no cause for further legal contact. I am of sound mind, in a safe environment, and not under duress. I have retained local legal counsel. Any further attempts to contact me under the guise of concern will be considered harassment. Sincerely, Martha Harlow. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the mailbox, the final act of a long-fought battle. In the days that followed, the silence from my family was deafening. No calls, no letters, no pleas for reconciliation. It was as if the letter had drawn a line so sharp and clear that they chose to retreat rather than cross it. I did not miss the calls or the accusations. Instead, I felt a strange lightness, a freedom that came from knowing I had set boundaries that would be respected. The house where I worked became my sanctuary, a place where I could breathe without the weight of judgment or expectation. Heather, the manager, handed me an apron embroidered with the words, "Not your grandma's kitchen," a small but meaningful gift that made me laugh louder than I had in months. Arthur continued his quiet visits, bringing stories and a warmth that settled around me like a comforting blanket. Yet, the most profound moment came not from others, but from within. One evening, as Joyce and I sat on the porch wrapped in blankets against the chill of an early fall night, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small card, the last piece of correspondence I had sent to my daughter. The 3 lines I had written were a balm and a boundary, a way to say goodbye without bitterness. Joyce sipped her wine and looked at me with eyes that held a mixture of admiration and understanding. "You're done," she said simply. "You stopped waiting." I nodded, feeling the truth of it settle deep inside me. For years I had waited, for recognition, for love, for a place where I belonged. Now I was done waiting. I was living. The weeks turned into months, and with each passing day, I built a life not defined by what I had lost, but by what I was creating. I baked lemon squares for the community potluck, a small act of generosity and connection that reminded me of the warmth of belonging. I attended trivia nights with Joyce where I insisted on questions from before 1990, a way to claim my place in a world that often felt too fast and unfamiliar. I discovered the simple joy of a full day's work, the honest exhaustion of serving coffee and refilling cups, the smile of a stranger who appreciated the steady rhythm of routine. Then, unexpectedly, a letter arrived from Kieran. His handwriting was large and deliberate, the words tentative yet full of hope. "Grandma, I'm coming to Portland. I want to see you. I'm not bringing anyone. I just want to talk." I read the letter slowly, feeling a warmth spread through my chest that I hadn't realized I had been missing. The boy who had once been part of the family drama was now a man reaching out with quiet hands, asking for connection on his own terms. When Friday morning came, I dressed carefully. Not for him, but for myself. My navy coat was clean and pressed, my hair brushed, and my lips painted with a color that made me feel alive. I didn't tell Joyce where I was going. She didn't ask. The Red Fern Motel was modest, its faded sign swinging gently in the breeze. I knocked once, and when the door opened, I was greeted by the same gentle eyes I remembered, the same awkward smile that spoke of uncertainty and hope. The room smelled of takeout and hotel soap, cluttered with books that told their own stories. We sat together, not too close, not too far. The space between us filled with years of unspoken words and tentative understanding. He told me about his job, his life, the quiet struggles and small victories. I told him about Portland, about the freedom that came from choosing myself. We didn't cry, but we breathed deeper, the weight of the past lifting just enough to let us breathe. When he handed me a small bundle wrapped carefully in paper, I knew it was more than a gift. It was a bridge. Inside was a book of poems, the ones he had underlined because they reminded him of me. I read them by lamplight that night, each line a thread weaving us closer together. The next morning, our goodbye was quiet, filled with a long hug and whispered wishes. "Be good to yourself," I said. "You too," he replied. And with that, he left, stepping back into a world that was still uncertain, but now held the possibility of reconnection. Back at the cafe, Heather handed me a new apron, deep green, and embroidered with a cheeky phrase that made me laugh and reminded me how far I had come. Arthur raised his mug in a silent salute, a gesture of shared understanding and quiet triumph. That evening, as I stood in the doorway of my room, the house smelled like garlic and warmth, and I felt the steady, comforting weight of belonging, not to a family defined by pain and control, but to a life I had chosen. Joyce called me to dinner, and as we ate quietly, I knew that this moment was more than an ending. It was a beginning, a reclaiming of self, a forging of new bonds, a testament to the strength found in choosing to live on one's own terms. They called me a parasite in the house I paid for. The words echoed in my mind, sharper than any knife, lingering long after the voices had faded into silence. I'm 82 now, living alone in a small apartment above a quiet street in Portland, a place I chose because it welcomed me without questions, without pasts to unravel or judgments to pass. The journey here was neither quick nor easy, but every step, every bitter sip of salted coffee, every quiet act of rebellion, every broken thread of family ties, led me to this moment of stillness, this fragile peace. I often think about that house I left behind, the one where I was once called a troublemaker, a shadow, an inconvenience. I think about my grandson's laughter ringing in the kitchen as he poured salt into my coffee, about the silence that followed my retaliation, and about the long months when I was made invisible by those I once trusted most. But here, in this small room filled with the soft light of morning, with a cup of proper coffee warming my hands, I have learned what it means to be truly seen, not by a family defined by pain and resentment, but by myself. The walls are lined with books I've collected over the years, each one a testament to stories I still hunger for, to voices that remind me I am not alone in my struggle. The scent of lavender drifts softly from a sachet I keep tucked in the dresser, a memory of a garden I once tended with loving hands. I have planted new roots here, fragile but growing, in soil that feels like forgiveness, not just from others, but from myself. Letters from my granddaughter arrive now and then, the youngest one who somehow saw past the cracks and whispered words of apology I never heard before. Her handwriting is shaky but sincere, filled with questions about my life, about the stories I used to tell, and about the memories we lost along the way. I treasure those letters like rare blooms, proof that even in the darkest winters, something beautiful can grow. I have not answered them yet. Sometimes I hold the pen in my fingers, ready to write back, and sometimes I simply read and fold the paper, letting the words sink in slowly. I think about the navy coat I bought on a whim, the one I wore the day I left, and that became my armor. It hangs now by the door, worn but proud, a symbol of a moment when I chose to step away from the bitterness and into the unknown. That coat carries the weight of my decision to reclaim my dignity, to refuse the role others wrote for me, and to carve out a space where I am more than the sum of their neglect. Some days, when the wind is sharp and the sky heavy, I wrap myself in it and feel the strength of all the women who came before me, who fought their own battles with quiet courage and fierce hearts. I have come to understand that freedom is not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it is the soft turning of a key in a lock, the gentle closing of a door behind you, the quiet breath taken before stepping into a room that is yours alone. It is in the small acts of self-care, the choices made to protect one's spirit, and the courage to walk away from those who would diminish you. I wish I could tell the younger women who feel invisible, who carry the weight of betrayal and rejection, that it is not their burden to bear forever, that their stories are not finished until they say so, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is the love you give yourself. The past will always be a part of me, like the lines etched on my face or the scars beneath my skin. But it no longer defines the woman I see in the mirror each morning. That woman is stronger, quieter, and unshakably determined. She has learned that dignity cannot be given or taken away. It must be claimed, protected, and nurtured from within. As I sit by the window now, watching the leaves turn gold and drift slowly to the ground, I smile softly. I am here. I am alive. I am free. And that, after all the salt and silence, is the sweetest taste of all.